Quintus Horatius Flaccus, better known to us simply as Horace, was one of the defining voices of Augustan Rome. Born in 65 BC, the son of a freedman, Horace received a rigorous education in Rome under the grammarian Orbilius. Later, he even served as a staff officer in Brutus's army during the Roman civil wars, experiences that sharpened his view of politics and the uncertainty of human fortune. As a poet, Horace mastered multiple forms, the biting epodis in 23 BC, the 3 books of Odes, and by 20 BC, his first epistles. These works secured his place as a poet of clarity, balance, and exquisite form. But beyond poetry, Horace also shaped the very theory of literature. Pause here and note this. His critical reputation rests above all on the Ars Poetica, or the art of poetry, written around 19 BC, asked in exam. Addressed to the Piso family, this long poetic letter in hexameter became one of the foundational texts of classical criticism. What did Horace argue? That a poem must have unity through harmony, proportion, and appropriate diction. Meter and style must always match the subject matter and the character. In other words, no lofty epic with silly language and no comic play weighed down with solemn grandeur. Horace reminded poets to look to antiquity for models, declaring, "A good model will always be found in Homer," asked in exam. And here's the ideal poet. According to Horace, he should combine moral and intellectual qualities. That means common sense, a knowledge of human character, respect for poetry's noble history, fidelity to high ideals, and humility to accept fair criticism. For Horace, poetry was not just craft, but vocation, a calling that demanded technical mastery and ethical seriousness. So, when you think of Horace, remember both sides, the lyric poet of Augustan Rome and the classical critic of the Ars Poetica. He gave later ages a model of poetry as balance, proportion, and moral seriousness standards that shaped literary theory for centuries. Let's step back to the 1st century CE to one of the greatest works of ancient literary criticism, on the Sublime. Though traditionally attributed to Longinus, its authorship remains uncertain. What survives of this treatise, even in incomplete form, is extraordinary. It draws examples from over 50 authors, Homer, Sappho, and even the biblical book of Genesis. In fact, Longinus pauses to admire the Jewish lawgiver who captured divine majesty in the words, "God said, let there be light, and there was." For him, such utterances are the essence of sublimity, grandeur of thought expressed with irresistible power. Now pause here and note this. The Sublime is not about logic or persuasion, but about ecstasy. Longinus says, "The Sublime leads the listeners not to persuasion, but ecstasy, for what is wonderful always goes together with a sense of dismay, and prevails over what is only convincing or delightful," asked in exam. In other words, the Sublime overwhelms reason, producing awe and exaltation, not just occasional pleasure, asked in exam. Where does sublimity come from? Longinus tells us it has both natural and learned sources. The inborn ones include great conceptions and intense passion. The acquired ones include rhetorical figures, noble diction, and dignified composition. Together, they create the union of genius and craft. That's why Longinus insists great poetry must spring from true genius and inspired emotion, asked in exam. What is not genuine sublimity? He warns us against mistaking imaginative feelings or the mere general effect of dignity for the real thing, asked in exam. Let's make this exam clear. Longinus lists 5 true sources of the Sublime: great thoughts, strong emotions, figures of speech and thought, noble diction, and dignified arrangement, asked in exam. Each of these lifts writing above the ordinary, making it an act of elevation. He even points to Sappho's Ode to Jealousy as an example of sublimity. Its concentrated emotion transforms personal passion into universal vision. For Longinus, Real sublimity requires nobility of soul, grandeur of conception, strong feeling, elevated diction, and artful figures asked in exam. Literature, he believed, has the power to shape the soul because sublime art pours greatness of spirit directly into words. And here's the golden takeaway on the sublime shifted criticism away from technical correctness toward the transcendent effect of style. Instead of asking, "Is this rule following?" Longinus asked, "Does this elevate us beyond ourselves?" That's why his treatise remains a cornerstone in the history of aesthetics, a timeless reminder that true art moves not just the mind but the spirit. A time when critics worried deeply about the decay of rhetoric, asked in exam, once the proud art of civic life, rhetoric had lost its power. Why? Two main reasons: the decline of political freedom and the spread of moral corruption. Without liberty and high moral purpose, the lofty spirit needed for sublime oratory simply vanished. Writers of the age noticed this decline. Petronius complained that schools of eloquence no longer trained speakers for truth or public service. Instead, they turned into showy arenas of empty display, pompous, artificial, and unnatural. Tacitus went further, pointing to the rise of the Principate and imperial rule. Rome may have gained stability and peace, but at the cost of censorship and free speech. Without political engagement, rhetoric withered into hollow style, detached from civic and ethical life. Pause here and note this. This is the context in which Longinus wrote on the Sublime. His emphasis on grandeur and authenticity in expression can be seen as a response, a defense against the hollow flourishes of decadent rhetoric. Where others saw decline, Longinus sought to restore the sublime as a way to revive genuine passion and moral seriousness in speech. So when you think of the decay of rhetoric, remember loss of freedom, moral corruption, Petronius's lament, Tacitus's warning, and Longinus's answer, the sublime as a way to resist decline. Let's journey back to medieval Florence, where in 1265 a boy named Dante Alighieri was born. His life was marked early by loss. His mother died when he was only 7, and his father soon remarried. But at the age of 12, Dante met Beatrice Portinari, the woman who would become the guiding star of his poetry and spirituality. His early poems to her were later collected in La Vita Nuova, The New Life, a youthful meditation on love and divine grace. As a writer, Dante drew inspiration from Homer and Virgil, but he also grew within the Tuscan circle of poets like Guido Cavalcanti, Lapo Gianni, and Sino da Pistoia. Politics, however, reshaped his destiny. When the Black Guelphs took power in Florence, Dante was exiled, refusing every conditional offer of return. For the rest of his life, he wandered Italy, finally settling in Ravenna, where he died in 1321. Now here's what you must note. Dante's masterpiece, La Commedia, later called the Divine Comedy, was begun in 1308 and finished just before his death in 1320. The poem traces his imagined journey through Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, asked in exam. Guided first by Virgil, who represents human reason, and later by Beatrice, who embodies divine love, Dante charts nothing less than the ascent of the soul from sin to salvation. Formerly, his greatest innovation was terza rima, a chain-rhymed tercet, where each stanza links to the next, giving the poem a continuous musical flow. Just as revolutionary was his choice to write not in Latin but in vernacular Italian, proving that the language of the people could rise to the level of high art. It was this daring choice that later made T.S. Eliot proclaim, "Dante and Shakespeare divide the world between them. There is no third." But Dante was also a prose thinker. In Convivio, the banquet, he envisioned a vernacular encyclopedia, mixing lyric poems with allegorical commentary. Its opening defended his choice of Italian over Latin as the language of knowledge, asked in exam. A theme he expanded on eloquence in the vernacular. This shows his commitment not only to poetry but to democratizing learning itself. And then there's the famous Letter to Can Grande della Scala, where Dante explained how the comedy should be read as a pilgrimage from confusion into divine vision. Comedy, he wrote, moves from darkness to light, from despair to joy. So when you remember Dante, think of three anchors. The Divine Comedy with its three realms of the soul's journey, asked in exam, Convivio as his defense of the vernacular, asked in exam, and his lifelong devotion to Beatrice as the symbol of love and grace. Dante was not just a poet, he was the poet of exile and salvation, a writer who transformed personal longing into one of the greatest spiritual epics in world literature. When we talk about the great Italian writers who shaped European literature, three names always come together: Dante, Petrarch, and Giovanni Boccaccio. Born in Tuscany in 1313, Boccaccio was the son of a wealthy merchant and a French mother. His education in Florence covered the 7 liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, and his early literary career blossomed in Naples. There, between 1335 and 1341, he encountered courtly culture, humanist learning, and fell in love with Fiammetta, a figure who inspired much of his writing. Pause here and note this: Boccaccio was a champion of the Tuscan vernacular over Latin. He experimented with new poetic forms, popularizing ottava rima and refining terza rima. This move from Latin to the language of everyday Tuscany was a cultural revolution, marking the shift from medieval allegory to Renaissance humanism. His greatest achievement is, of course, the Decameron, composed between 1348 and 52, and later revised in the 1370s as in exam. Written during the Black Death, the frame narrative follows 10 young Florentines who retreat to the countryside to escape the plague. Each day, over 10 days, they tell one story, each 100 tales in total. The stories range from romance to tragedy, comedy to satire, always blending wit with moral reflection. Each day even ends with a canzone, showing Boccaccio's mix of prose and poetry. Can you recall why the Decameron matters beyond Italy? Because Geoffrey Chaucer borrowed from it directly. Troilus and Chryside was inspired by Boccaccio's Il Filostrato, 1338, and The Knight's Tale drew from Teseida, 1340-41. Without Boccaccio, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales would have looked very different. But Boccaccio's legacy goes further. His L'amorosa visione and Il ninfale d'Ameto show his early experiments with allegory and mixed genres. In his later years, he devoted himself to Dante between 1373 and 74. He even delivered public lectures on the Divine Comedy and produced a commentary asked in exam. Another monumental work was Genealogia Deorum Gentilium on the genealogy of the pagan gods, a 15-book mythographical encyclopedia begun in 1350 and first printed in 1472. The final 2 books defend the value of poetry itself, making it one of Boccaccio's most extended contributions to literary theory. So, in Boccaccio we see a bridge from the medieval world to Renaissance humanism, from Latin scholarship to the living vernacular, and from allegory to realism. And through the Decameron asked in exam, he gave Europe not only its first great prose masterpiece, but also the model for modern storytelling itself. And that wraps up Chapter 1, Classical Criticism. We've journeyed through Plato, Aristotle, Horace, Longinus, Dante, and Boccaccio, 6 pillars whose ideas continue to shape how we read and think about literature even today. Remember, everything you need for this chapter is already waiting for you in the app lesson plan, videos, PDF notes, PYQs, last-minute revision notes, classroom notes, and the diary notes hub. So if you haven't already, download the app now and keep all your study resources in one place. Stay consistent, stay curious, and let's move step by step toward mastering the entire syllabus together.